I'm Cody Gilkison, Chairman of the Board for Danville Pride. Welcome to our 2025 monthly educational video series, where we dive into important topics about the LGBTQ+ community and our shared experiences. At Danville Pride, we believe education is the key to building understanding and creating a more inclusive community. That's why we're bringing you this series, to highlight issues, share stories, and foster conversations that matter. Each month we'll cover a new topic, everything from LGBTQ+ history and allyship to mental health and intersectionality. And I'll be joined by a special guest in every episode to share their unique perspective and expertise. Our goal? To educate, empower, and embrace everyone in our community one conversation at a time. So whether you're a member of the LGBTQ+ community, an ally, or just curious to learn more, this series is for you. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to stay updated on new episodes. We can't wait to take this journey with you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of our Danville Pride Education Series. I'm Cody Gilkison. I'm really glad to be here with you today. Today is a special, interesting episode. We had a full year planned out for these, and our guest in October was supposed to be Terry Lake, who we lost recently. So we have decided to pivot and make this first episode all about Terry. So, that being said, let's dig in. Welcome to this month's installment of our virtual education series. Today's session is a deeply personal one for me. As many of you know, we had initially planned to explore LGBTQ+ history in October of this year with the invaluable insights of our dear friend, Terry Lake. Tragically, Terry passed away suddenly on January 1st. His loss is deeply felt by all of us who were touched by his kindness, his activism, and most of all, his indomitable spirit. In Terry's absence, we're honoring his memory by moving this session to January, dedicating it to his incredible life and the unique ways he intersected with pivotal moments in LGBTQ+ history. Terry's lived experiences placed him alongside some of the most iconic figures and events in our shared struggle for equality. Today, we'll reflect on his stories, his sacrifices, and the lessons we can take from his journey. So, rather than a traditional history lesson, this episode is going to be telling just one of many, many stories that made up the life of a real Danville hero. Just 2 days before his passing, that Monday, Terry reached out to me, sort of out of the blue, and shared some really powerful messages with me, reflecting on his place in LGBTQ+ history. These memories to me serve as a window into the extraordinary life he led and the historic moments that he was a part of. Terry was more than a witness to history. He was an active participant in history. He's a self-described foot soldier in the fight for LGBTQ+ rights and justice, but also someone who was dedicated to making our city and Danville a better place. Let's take this time and honor Terry's legacy by exploring the moments and people he so vividly described. We'll see the intersection of his life with the Stonewall uprising, the AIDS epidemic, and his grassroots activism, and consider the lasting impact of his work here in Vermilion County and beyond. So I want to start by just reading an article that was put out in 2023 about Terry, to give you guys a little bit better of an understanding that don't all know Terry like we do. So Terry Lake is a West Downtown Danville resident that has dug his heels in and worked tirelessly for many years. What's the consensus? He's a heck of a good guy. Terry had been involved in making Danville a better place in a multitude of ways, from planting trees in his neighborhood for future generations to pandemic LGBTQIA+ support groups. This human has gone above and beyond for his community, As a resident of the West Downtown neighborhood, he was instrumental in the founding of their neighborhood association. The aesthetics and development of this gorgeous neighborhood has come a long way, and a few residents care for many lots. Terry and his partner care for a whopping 14 lots in the neighborhood, and they are not the only ones with an impressive number like this. Their labor of love involving mowing properties and donating saplings to the neighborhood has not gone unnoticed. Their neighborhood is a true reflection of that good that happens when people do their part. Neighbors are a big part of the reason why you stay. It's the people, Terry says as he smiles and looks on his elder's neighbor's house. Terry's been a part of the Vermilion County AIDS Task Force for 15 years and has been instrumental in reducing the number of AIDS cases in Vermilion County through prevention and education. He was involved in the New Jersey coalition that advocated for the rights of LGBTQIA+ community, which included laws for basic human rights. While providing support for this, he also simultaneously was a sexton at the Episcopal Church of the Holy Trinity. He adds even more dimension to his character, demonstrating support for Black rights by attending NAACP meetings and local marches. He sees the issues and hardships that affect various communities, but embraces the negativity right alongside the joy. If we're just acknowledging joy, how phony are we? There's suffering just outside that door. I have shielded myself from some of it, but that does not mean you take your privilege for granted. We give to every community, Terry says. To top it off, Terry stepped in and helped to recreate the Humane Society when it needed support and restructuring. He was dedicating his time for a year and a half, 7 days a week, to the organization during the transition. He has also devoted time and effort for nearly 4 years to beautifying and cleaning the Fisher, as well as taking on ushering and volunteering in the theater cafe. Terry has taken multiple positions with the Democratic Party, including vice chair and secretary of the party. He's provided an alliance and trust with many communities, and it all comes down to doing the right thing. I feel like I always advocate for what's right, even if it means supporting people I don't get along with. I'll support what they're doing if it's right, Terry says. We could all learn a thing or two from this beautiful human. It's uncommon to have this large of a heart, and it's even more uncommon to see someone who also has the fire to put it into action. Isn't that a lovely article? I read that and I thought, man, people really loved Terry, right? And he did so much for this community and other communities, and he's a great example of active allyship. And that's something that I want to teach you guys about during this series. A good friend of mine, Jessica Nieto, has always told me that active allyship is the only true allyship, and that passive allyship is a dirty word, right? Passive allyship means I support you, but I won't stand up for you, right? Active allyship means in rooms where there are people who I know will disagree with you, even if you're not there, I will stand up for you. That's an active ally, and that's what we need. And Terry was that big time, right? So I want to go through the message that Terry sent me that Monday before he passed. And the way we're going to do this episode is I'm going to break up his message with little bits of historical insights. And then we're going to get through all the way to the end. And then I'm going to share a really special video with you guys. So I'm going to start with a section of this message that Terry sent me that's about the Stonewall uprising and that piece. The message, I'm not reading it in its entirety from top to bottom. I'm taking it piece by piece. But this is a piece that I thought should go first. So this part is about Stonewall and the birth of the LGBTQ movement. Terry says, little by little, I'm educating myself to issues in the community that I wasn't well aware of. I just knew that Marsha P. Johnson was brave/angry enough to throw a brick at the NYC police in the Stonewall uprising. Marsha and Sylvia Rivera were still on the scene often when I lived in NYC, and one night she talked to me about the riots and how by driving the officers into full-on retreat who turned and was coming down the back streets of the Stonewall, that they passed through one of the buildings and came out head-on at retreating police, making their numbers seem twice as large. And then I never really spoke to her again. but she always smiled and nodded when our paths crossed at one of the activist groups. Then suddenly, she was found floating in the Hudson River, and all her allies believed she was murdered. It certainly wouldn't have been suicide like they tried to proclaim. She was the first person to identify as transgender to me. I missed an opportunity to delve deeper into history, but we were busy on all fronts, naming and passing legislation, battling AIDS in what at the time was the largest population of people living and dying with AIDS. I'll stop there with Terry's message. So, breaking down, Terry has regret for not stopping and breathing in and learning more from these people who he crossed paths with, like Marsha and Sylvia. People who he knew were vitally important. But only now are we realizing how important Marsha and Sylvia really were to this movement. Now, there's debate about who actually threw the first brick at the Stonewall uprising. Most eyewitness accounts would say that it was either Marsha or Sylvia. Marsha thinks it was her. Sylvia isn't sure, but she thought it might be her. So that's kind of where we are. It's a little ambiguous. But I will tell you that Marsha was among the first drag queens to frequent Greenwich Village's Stonewall Inn after the famous gay bar first started admitting women and drag queens rather than just gay men. Before that, it was just gay men. But she was one of the first to fight for her right to come into the Stonewall, right? And in these times, the Stonewall, like many gay bars, were sort of, we'll say, mafia affiliated, right? And there was always the threat of police raids. Police would come and raid a gay bar, a suspected gay bar, for anything. And they used to have laws like you could only wear one article of the other gender's clothing, right? And they would get people on that. And they'd throw them all in the paddy wagon and they'd send them down to the station. And Marsha really stood up against that despite being arrested a number of times. She was a central figure in the Stonewall uprising. And the Stonewall uprising, if you don't know, was a result of one of these raids that just went wrong. And somebody, and we think it was Marsha, I believe it was Marsha, in my heart I believe it was Marsha, threw the first brick through a window at the police who had barricaded themselves inside the Stonewall Inn after everybody was kicked out. And all of these were just in retaliation, as I said, to violent police raids. Other people joined in, and the riots lasted a number of days. The other person in this story is Sylvia Rivera. So Sylvia Rivera was a transgender American woman, an LGBTQ liberation activist, and a self-identified drag queen of Puerto Rican and Venezuelan descent, born and raised in New York City. She was orphaned at 3 years old and homeless at 11, giving her personal insight into the experiences of many queer youth whom she referred to as her children. She was a key figure in the queer rights movement in the United States, earning a fierce reputation and eventual respect by the early 1960s, further cementing her presence. And then her being there on the ground at the Stonewall riots further cemented her place in history. Sylvia is known as more of the one who would show up to rallies, who would go and speak at events. But the community sort of turned on Sylvia. And as history began to write what had happened at Stonewall, suddenly Sylvia was sort of written out, and it was all about Marsha. And Sylvia and Marsha were dear friends, but Sylvia, to her dying day, was always fighting to be recognized for her place in queer history. So now we know good enough to give Sylvia her flowers for what she really did. Also, we noted in Terry's message that Marsha was the first person to identify as transgender to Terry. In a time in the 1970s when that was something that was a rarity even for a very active gay man like Terry, right? So this creates a ripple effect through his life of support and activism beyond just gay man's rights, right? Because it's also about queer people as an umbrella. It's also about women. It's also about people of color. Terry knew this, and we see this through his activism. So next, we're going to talk about the AIDS epidemic. I call this section a community under siege, right? And I'm going to read you a little more of Terry's message. He says, I didn't even realize that Sylvia had died until the onset of the pandemic, and I began reflecting a bit. I used to never reflect much, just remained focused on the tasks at hand, a kind of here and now kind of guy. I never thought about the history that was happening all around me. I was at Vito Russo's Why We Fight speech, famous Why We Fight speech. I never really got to talk to Vito, yet heard him speak more than once. I thought he was kind of rude and crude, and I still probably would think that. And I thought he was wrong about many things. But now I know. Bluntly, Vito told the damn truth. He was fucking right about it all. It's hard to think about it. I was mostly young and scared all the time, trying like hell to survive and find a little bit of time to burn up the dance floor, drive around at night in the city, ride the subway for hours or the Staten Island ferry back and forth. After Vito Russo died, and my friend Patrick P, who flew us to Mexico to buy us AIDS drugs, was imprisoned on fraud charges. He had been laundering money to buy the meds, which they never figured out. I waited until he managed to bail out and get probation, and decided to move on back home here to die in peace. And I'm going to leave that piece there. So, Terry's experiences during the height of the AIDS epidemic, he was fighting, but Terry was also living a really full and vital life. I think of the imagery of young Terry burning up the dance floor, driving around at night in the city, riding the subway for hours, or riding the Staten Island ferry back and forth. And I can just see the joy on his face, right? So he was having a good time. And this anonymous Patrick P, who we don't really know, risking his life flying back and forth from Mexico to get illegal AIDS drugs and bringing them back and then going to prison on fraud charges, but then never figuring out what he was laundering the money for, right? It's how Terry wound up with a big stash of AIDS drugs before he moved back to Danville. And that bit at the end, where Terry came back to Danville to die, is really, really poignant when you know the rest of Terry's story, which we'll get to. He also mentions Vito Russo in there. And if you don't know Vito Russo, he was an American LGBTQ advocate, activist, a film historian, and an author. Forgive me for tripping over my words a little bit. I usually do these with a guest, and I'm feeling the pressure of trying to highlight the life of someone so important. So stay with me and forgive me, and I promise I'm going to edit out as much of my flubs as I can, but I want to get through this and do it justice, so bear with me. So Vito Russo was an American LGBTQ activist, film historian, and an author. He's best remembered as the author of the book The Celluloid Closet, which came out in 1981 and was revised in 1987. And that book was described in the New York Times as an essential reference book on homosexuality in the U.S. film industry. In 1985, he co-founded GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, a media watchdog organization that strives to end anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and advocates for LGBT inclusion in popular media. So Vito is really, really important. And I think it's also important to note here that sometimes we don't even recognize sometimes the people around us that are saying stuff that we might not agree with, that later on down the years, we'll look back like Terry does on Vito and realize everything was right. That's something that we all can reflect on. Like, who's the person who's pushing it a little too far? Can you picture years down the line them being proven right? Something to think about, right? That speech that he was present for the "Why We Fight" speech is something that stuck with Terry, that he talked about a little bit more in his messages with me. That, you know, if I had jumped in the bandwagon with Vito, more than just seeing him and sort of being like, "Ooh, the guy's crass and rude," but if I'd really subscribed to what he was saying, I could have made even more of a difference. That's an interesting note, and we're going to come back to that in a bit. So now we're going to talk about grassroots advocacy, and this is where that bit about the foot soldier that I mentioned at the beginning comes up. So Terry says, "But I kept pace with my duties like a foot soldier. A man I believe was named Steve, I could probably find his name in old address books, was an ex-Catholic priest who was excommunicated for being gay, who'd been paralyzed from the waist down in a skiing accident. He lived in some new luxurious condo in Secaucus in the Hackensack with spectacular views of the New Jersey wetlands. I was his buddy through the Hyacinth Foundation. He always dropped hundreds of dollars in my jacket or my pocket and made me promise to only spend it on less fortunate people on my buddy list. There were so many young, beautiful people just gone. I guess there's no way to tell all their stories. Sometimes when I dream, I see their eyes, accepting their fate, holding their hands, at a time when I did far, far more listening than speaking. I believe it made me solid enough to survive. I also loved that Steve didn't hesitate to loan me that great big Cadillac every time I needed it. Ha ha ha." Steve would hold my hand and tell me I was going to be all right. He always called me his foot soldier. Now we're going to stop there. So this is where Terry starts to feel like he has a place in the movement, right? Because this guy, Steve, maybe Steve, we don't know if his name is Steve. Terry said he could probably find his name in an address book, which is a very Terry thing to say, right? But this man had such an impact on him by describing him as a foot soldier in the movement, right? I also see a lasting impression being made on Terry here when he says that his buddy would drop hundreds of dollars in his pocket and make him promise to spend it on the less fortunate people on his buddy list. That stuck with him. You can see that, right? And then him reflecting on all of the young, beautiful people that he experienced such joy with in New York City in those days and their dying moments. And being part of the Hyacinth Foundation got him right there to that, right? The Hyacinth Foundation is an organization. It was actually the first, I believe, one of the first sort of AIDS hospice organizations who cared about the end of life for these people who were dying of HIV and AIDS. And he donated a lot of time there. And like he says, he did far, far more listening to these people, accepting their fate. Right? It gives us a real insight into Terry to know that sometimes when he dreamed, he saw their eyes, right? That's major and something that really stuck with me from those messages. I think the personal impact of being a caregiver and an advocate for those facing unimaginable loss made a big impact on Terry. It also speaks of the compassion and solidarity, like his friendship with Steve, the ex-priest who supported his efforts, right? It really gives us great insight, that passage, I think. So now we're going to move on to the last section about Terry's legacy and his local impact. So this picks up at the part of the message where he said he was going back to Danville to die in peace. He says, "With a 2-year drug supply in my hands, it was 3 years before I walked into Carl Clinic, and the clinician presumed that I had just been infected, and talked a story of hope and how some people were making it 10 years. I simply let them believe that I was newly infected, and I started over." Met Greg a few years later and just kind of froze in time. Held 25 consecutive candlelight marches up the busiest stretch of North Vermilion during the highest traffic time from 5 to 6 p.m. Stood at the pulpit of St. Paul's Catholic Church 20 times. It took them 5 years to invite us in, and I insulted them over and over, and over and over they invited me back, and even questioned my disbanding the group in its 25th year. None of that would have been possible had it not been for a transgender person brave enough to throw a brick and lead the charge in a time when bricks were flying through the windows of LGBTQ people on a regular basis. So Terry tells us, about some of the work that he did here in Danville after he thought he was going to come here and die. He came here and thrived. Right? He found his way to make our community wonderful and make people in Danville accepting enough for an organization like Danville Pride to be able to openly say that we're operating in downtown Danville. That would not have been possible without the groundwork that Terry laid for 25 consecutive candlelight marches, right? And doing the AIDS task force for over 15 years. And Terry got all that strength from Marsha and from Patrick and from Steve. And I think most importantly, despite all those people being important in his life and being important historical figures, I believe that he found his purpose when he met Greg. And Greg, if you don't know Greg, he's still a member of our community and is just a really good, solid person that we should rally around. He inspired Terry quite a bit, and that always came across really clearly to me in conversations with him, that he wouldn't be the Terry that we know and love without his rock at home, right? They were very lucky to have each other. He was very lucky to have Greg, and I believe that Greg will always say that he was very, very lucky to have Terry. So Terry leaves us work for today. So this is where I'm going to give you a little bit of a call to action. Terry was someone who believed in supporting every community who needs support. We can call them underprivileged communities or minority communities or whatever you want to call them. But if somebody could benefit from Terry's voice, Terry would lift his voice. And we can all learn from that. Now, what I want to leave you with today, and again, forgive me for being a little all over the place in this episode. I only knew Terry for a year, but Terry made such an impact on me. We fought, Terry had very, very strong opinions, and at times we were at odds. But I have a very deep respect for Terry, and learning more about his life only cements that further. And I hope that everybody can have these same sort of feelings when they think of Terry Lake, about what he stood for as an icon of our community, as someone who put in the work to make our community beautiful. Terry left a lasting impression that's going to be there forever. And earlier we were talking about that speech that Vito Russo gave, that Terry was present for. And I'm leaving this episode a little shorter than we normally would do because I'm putting time at the end for us to watch the video. I was able to find video of the speech that Terry was present at. Now you can't see him in the audience. If you want to watch and scan for him, unfortunately I've done the scanning and you can't see him. But this speech, years later, is one that Terry realized everything Vito said was right. And it had a real impact on him. So I want that speech to have that same impact on us. So I'm going to roll the outro, and we're going to end this episode. But after the outro rolls, I'm going to play that video, and I would love it if you would stick through it. It's 11 minutes long, and it's really beautiful. All right. Until next time, it has been my honor to host this episode. And we will see you next time. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't already, please check out Danville Pride on Facebook and give us a follow to stay up to date on our latest events and announcements. We'll see you next time.
A friend of mine in New York City has a half-fare transit card, which means that you get on buses and subways for half price. And the other day when he showed his card to the token attendant, the attendant asked what his disability was, and he said, "I have AIDS." And the attendant said, "No, you don't. If you had AIDS, you'd be home dying." And so I wanted to speak out today as a person with AIDS who is not dying. You know, for the last 3 years since I was diagnosed, my family thinks two things about my situation. One, they think I'm going to die. And two, they think that my government is doing absolutely everything in their power to stop that. And they're wrong on both counts. So if I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from homophobia. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from racism. If I'm dying from anything, it's from indifference and red tape, because these are the things that are preventing an end to this crisis. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from Jesse Helms. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the President of the United States. And especially if I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the sensationalism of newspapers and magazines and television shows, which are interested in me as a human interest story only as long as I'm willing to be a helpless victim, but not if I'm fighting for my life. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the fact that not enough rich, white, heterosexual men have gotten AIDS for anybody to give a shit. You know, living with AIDS in this country is like living in the Twilight Zone. Living with AIDS is like living through a war which is happening only for those people who happen to be in the trenches. Every time a shell explodes, you look around and you discover that you've lost more of your friends. But nobody else notices. It isn't happening to them. They're walking the streets as though we weren't living through some sort of nightmare. And only you can hear the screams of the people who are dying and their cries for help. No one else seems to be noticing. And it's worse than a war, because during a war, people are united in a shared experience. This war has not united us, it's divided us. It's separated those of us with AIDS and those of us who fight for people with AIDS from the rest of the population. 2.5 years ago, I picked up Life magazine and I read an editorial which said, "It's time to pay attention because this disease is now beginning to strike the rest of us." It was as if I wasn't the one holding the magazine in my hand. And since then, nothing has changed to alter the perception that AIDS is not happening to the real people in this country. It's not happening to us in the United States, it's happening to them. To the disposable populations of fags and junkies who deserve what they get. The media tells them that they don't have to care because the people who really matter are not in danger. Twice, 3 times, 4 times, the New York Times has published editorials saying, "Don't panic yet over AIDS. It still hasn't entered the general population, and until it does, we don't have to give a shit." And the days and the months and the years pass by, and they don't spend those days and nights and months and years trying to figure out how to get hold of the latest experimental drug and which dose to take it at and in what combination with other drugs and from what source and how are you going to pay for it and where are you going to get it, because it isn't happening to them, so they don't give a shit. And they don't sit in television studios surrounded by technicians who are wearing rubber gloves, who won't put a microphone on you, because it isn't happening to them, so they don't give a shit. And they don't have their houses burned down by bigots and morons. They watch it on the news and they have dinner and they go to bed because it isn't happening to them and they don't give a shit. And they don't spend their waking hours going from hospital room to hospital room and watching the people that they love die slowly of neglect and bigotry because it isn't happening to them and they don't have to give a shit. They haven't been to 2 funerals a week for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. So they don't give a shit because it's not happening to them. And we read on the front page of the New York Times last Saturday that Anthony Fauci now says that all sorts of promising drugs for treatment haven't even been tested in the last 2 years because he can't afford to hire the people to test them. We're supposed to be grateful that this story has appeared in the newspaper after 2 years. Nobody wonders why some reporter didn't dig up that story and print it 18 months ago before Fauci got dragged before a congressional hearing. How many people are dead in the last 2 years who might be alive today if those drugs had been tested more quickly? Reporters all over the country are busy printing government press releases. They don't give a shit. It isn't happening to them. Meaning that it isn't happening to people like them, the real people, the world-famous general public we all keep hearing about. Legionnaire's disease was happening to them because it hit people who looked like them, who sounded like them, who were the same color as them. And that fucking story about a couple of dozen people hit the front page of every newspaper and magazine in this country, and it stayed there until that mystery got solved. All I read in the newspapers tells me that the mainstream white heterosexual population is not at risk for this disease. All the newspapers I read tell me that IV drug users and homosexuals still account for the overwhelming majority of cases and the majority of those people at risk. Then can somebody please tell me why every single penny allocated for education and prevention gets spent on ad campaigns that are directed almost exclusively to white heterosexual teenagers who they keep telling us are not at risk? Can somebody tell me why the only television movie ever produced by a major network in this country about the impact of this disease is not about the impact of this disease on the man who has AIDS, but of the impact of AIDS on his white, straight, nuclear family? Why for 8 years, every newspaper and magazine in this country has done cover stories on AIDS only when the threat of heterosexual transmission is raised? Why for 8 years, every single educational film designed for use in high schools has eliminated any gay positive material before being approved by the Board of Education? Why for 8 years, every single public information pamphlet and videotape distributed by establishment sources has ignored specific homosexual content? Why is every bus and subway ad I read and every advertisement and every billboard I see in this country specifically not directed at gay men? Don't believe the lie that the gay community has done its job and done it well and educated its people. The gay community and IV drug users are not all politicized people living in New York and San Francisco. Members of minority populations, including so-called sophisticated gay men, are abysmally ignorant about AIDS. If it is true that gay men and IV drug users are the populations at risk for this disease, then we have a right to demand that education and prevention be targeted specifically to these people, and it is not happening. We are being allowed to die while low-risk populations are being panicked, not educated, panicked into believing that we deserve to die. Why are we here together today? We're here because it is happening to us, and we do give a shit. And if there were more of us and less of them, AIDS wouldn't be what it is at this moment in history. It's more than just a disease, which ignorant people have turned into an excuse to exercise the bigotry they have always felt. It is more than a horror story exploited by the tabloids. AIDS is really a test of us as a people. When future generations ask what we did in this crisis, we're going to have to tell them that we were out here today. And we have to leave a legacy to those generations of people who will come after us. Someday the AIDS crisis will be over. Remember that. Right on. And when that day comes, when that day has come and gone, there will be people alive on this earth, gay people and straight people, men and women, black and white, who will hear the story that once there was a terrible disease in this country and all over the world, and that a brave group of people stood up and fought, and in some cases gave their lives so that other people might live and be free. So I'm proud to be with my friends today and the people I love, because I think you're all heroes, and I'm glad to be part of this fight. But to borrow a phrase from Michael Callan's song, all we have is love right now. What we don't have is time. In a lot of ways, AIDS activists are like those doctors out there. They're so busy putting out fires and taking care of people on respirators that they don't have the time to take care of all the sick people. We're so busy putting out fires right now that we don't have the time to talk to each other and strategize and plan for the next wave and the next day and the next month and the next week and the next year. And we're going to have to find the time to do that in the next few months. We have to commit ourselves to doing that. And then after we kick the shit out of this disease, we're all going to be alive to kick the shit out of this system so that this never happens again.
All of us at Danville Pride, we love you, Terry.